Well, Javier Milei has the internet buzzing due to a rather seismic speech he made before the World Economic Forum for its annual meeting in Davos. And the speech was basically a grand apologia, defense of free market capitalism, an attack against socialism, and a statement of certain principles that, in both Milei's worldview and also, I believe, in reality, are necessary for prospering societies and also moral societies to remain constant in their existence. And so there were a few parts of this speech that actually interested me quite a bit, that I think that perhaps have the most meat to them. The entire thing had substance, of course. But these, in my opinion, had the most meat to them insofar as you can take what he said in these instances and you can take them further than just what he said in the speech. And so I'll be going over like 3 different instances, and then I'm going to go ahead and explain what this speech means generally for those of us in the West, and the political significance and the philosophical significance of this speech as well, going forward in the 21st century. But one thing should be noted. The fact that Milei made this type of speech in a forum like the World Economic Forum, which is on the level of the geopolitical institutions in the West that are uniformly captured by some of the very ideas that Milei laid out in his speech, is not only unprecedented, it's not only extraordinary, it takes a lot of bravery, a lot of intellectual bravery, a lot of moral bravery. And I think that that kind of ethic, that kind of behavior should be emulated more by a lot of political observers, whether they be the president of a country, whether they be a representative in their country, whether they be media personality or content creator like me. We need to have that kind of courage, because too many of us are focused entirely on what others think of us, as opposed to how we are rendered in the eyes of the truth. So let us begin. The first part of this speech that I found particularly interesting was when Milei begins and he talks about how collectivism is not the solution to the world's problems. Go.
Thank you very much. Today I am present to inform you that the Western world is facing a significant threat. It is in danger because those who are supposed to defend the values of the Western world are co-opted by a worldview that inevitably leads to socialism and consequently to poverty and economic deprivation. Unfortunately, in recent decades, motivated by some well-intentioned desires to help others, and others by the desire to belong to a privileged caste, the main leaders of the Western world have abandoned the model of freedom for different versions of what we call collectivism. We are here to tell you that collectivist experiments are never the solution to the problems that afflict the citizens of the world, but rather they are their cause.
Well, I think just on its face, he's absolutely correct. But I want to go a little bit deeper and a little bit further than he did. I think Milei makes the mistake that a lot of people tend to make when discussing these ideas. The mistake of what I call over-charitability. Well, what's charitability? Charitability is when you give credit to your opponent's viewpoints by trying to represent them in the best light possible, even if after you do that, you seek to tear them down through reason and argumentation. I think the principle of charitability is not just a good rhetorical and intellectual principle, but it's also a fundamentally and important social principle, because you cannot have healthy social relationships in the absence of goodwill between people. People don't have to love each other, but they have to have goodwill. They have to be able to extend a bit of themselves and their sympathy and their understanding towards their fellow man, or else the only other alternative is going to be hatred or some kind of conflict, or at the very best, indifference. And if you are indifferent to your fellow man, you cannot build a society with your fellow man. So what Milei is trying to do, he's trying to say that there are people who push socialism and who push these ideas who are well-intentioned. Well, I think that we have to really actually examine that question. Are these people that push socialism and push these ideas that are just fundamentally a rejection of sound moral thinking and sound economic thinking, are they well-intentioned? I don't even believe that we can render someone's behavior in a certain light just by looking at their intentions. Because if you know, or you could have found out that your ideas are destructive, if you know, or you could have found out that your ideas make no sense logically, if you know, or you could have found out, which many socialists do know and do find out, that when their ideas are implemented, bloodshed and chaos and terror and disorder and totalitarianism tends to follow, then my friends, I don't care what your stated intentions are. It is very obvious to me that the intentions conveyed by your actions are that of apathy, at the very best being charitable, or at the very worst that of malevolence, because you are willing to ignore evil despite the link it has with your worldview. That is not good intentions. There is literally entire schools of socialist leftist apologia that try to conjure up, like with magical incantations, rhetorical defenses of some of the most horrific regimes and organizations in the history of the world that have taken the mantle of their worldview up and implemented them into material form. You don't believe me? Why do you think communists, Stalinists, socialists will often tell you that the USSR was not really a socialist or a communist country? It was a state capitalist country, even though state capitalism is a contradiction in terms. You can't have a system where the free flow of ideas and exchange exist while at the same time having a centralized mechanism control the system. It's literally a rhetorical error that is presented as plausible to people who already have a rhetorically flawed idea of what capitalism is, already have an imaginary idea of what the individual is, already have a wrong idea of what society is, and then with all these errors reinforcing their rhetorical nonsense, they push these arguments with the strength of Hercules. They attempt to make apologia. So the intentions, my friends, I think the intention is apathy in some cases. In other cases, it's just pure malevolence. Now, Milei did say it. There are people that push it to enshrine themselves in an upper caste. But we should never give too much leeway to worldviews that are demonstrably false on a moral level and a social level, and also demonstrably destructive on an empirical level. Because the moment we do that is the moment we lend credibility to these ideas. There is no credibility to a communist or a socialist worldview. There's credibility to some of the subjects they address, like poverty. Poverty, obviously, is a very important issue that must be addressed and must be addressed with the forthright of vigor and passion and also reason. But poverty is not an issue that can be addressed if it is the central premise of your political framework, as it is with socialism, where they split people into the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The central premise is not to address poverty as poverty itself. Their central premise is to view poverty as something that informs political behavior and then cast people who are in a certain class in society towards a certain disposition, and that is the revolutionary disposition, and that means creating this tension between the 1% and the 99% in colloquial terms, and that's what we have today. It's not about poverty. It's about this deterministic worldview of how society is going to be pushed forward on the basis of materialism. That's what it's about. So, it's just important to say that, because I don't think that anyone who pushes these ideas are well-intentioned. I don't believe that, and I never will believe that. They can be confused, but the confused are not the well-intentioned. If you can't even know what a good intention is, how can you be well-intentioned? You can't. It's impossible. So moving on, he addresses social justice. Now, particularly, this is actually very interesting, because the World Economic Forum is a place where they have basically plotted to implement equity and all kind of other concepts that are integral to social justice into the sort of digital interfaces that are now emerging in the world, like the metaverse. They've done entire things about that, how to make AI more equitable and more politically conscious and more socially conscious. So it's interesting to see him launch a salvo against social justice, which kind of represents all those things in this form where they push for it so hard. So, watch.
The issue is that social justice is unfair and doesn't contribute to general well-being. On the contrary, it's an inherently unfair idea because it's violent. It's unfair because the state is financed through taxes, and taxes are collected coercively. Or can any of us confidently say that they pay taxes of their own free will? This implies that the state is funded through coercion, and that the higher the tax burden, the greater the coercion, leading to a reduction in freedom. Those who promote social justice start from the idea that the economy as a whole is a cake that can be distributed in a different way. But that cake is not given. It is wealth that is generated in what, for example, Israel Kirchner calls a market discovery process.
Again, another great point. Social justice does indeed begin with a premise about economics that is unsound and false. But I would go a little bit further as well on this one. Social justice is not just an economic ideology. It's way more than that. Social justice is a worldview, a broader worldview that has economic implications, not an economic worldview that has broader implications. That's very important to understand. So when we get to the idea of social justice, it's very important to understand what we are talking about. So the original idea of justice, if we want to investigate the etymology and then the historical context of this word, simply meant, going all the way back to Francisco Suarez, who was a Spanish scholastic thinker, and who basically started the modern day natural law, natural rights tradition that went from Thomas Aquinas, ended up in Suarez's hands, went from Suarez's hands, went to the philosopher Hugo Grotius, who then formulated it in the best way known at that time, and then from his hands, it went to the hands of John Locke eventually. There are others in between Grotius and Locke, but for the sake of accessibility, let's just say after Grotius, it goes down to Locke. Locke didn't create it. Grotius really formulated it from Suarez. So it meant ius, which simply meant things that you have, a right, things that you have, that you possess by virtue of being a human being. And justice was developed from that idea, meant to defend that which you possess by virtue of your humanity. This is where our concept of rights come from. The idea that rights are moral qualities that are integral to your human nature, that are found and justified by reason, and that therefore are objective since they are rather unchanging and they are necessary for a man to have any kind of life at all, much less a good life. And justice was meant to be this ethical principle which safeguards those things, those qualities, and that which flows from them. So my right to self-ownership, what flows from that? Well, property rights flow from that. My right to freedom of speech, what flows from that? Well, my conscience then produces a thought and that flows from that, so on and so forth. That was what justice initially meant. You come around to like the 70s and 80s, and the popular definition of justice flips entirely. It's no longer about protecting objective natural rights that are indicative of a broader system of human nature. No. It is now about advancing certain groups at the level of distribution over other groups that are perceived to have certain advantages compared to those groups you want to advance. This is where the idea of equity comes. So what social justice does is it takes a principle which can only really happen on an individual level. I can be just or unjust towards my neighbor. I can let him keep his stuff, or I can steal his stuff. But it abstracts it to a level that no one except institutions of power can interact with. How am I going to be socially just to a group when I don't interact with groups? I interact with concrete individuals. It is an error in thinking that produces an abstract thought which is then used through political mechanisms to enshrine a kind of tyrannical order upon the human being. It is a worldview that corrupts what justice actually means, divorces it from its natural law context, and puts it into the hands of activists and busybodies who don't actually care about justice. They care about advancing their agenda through the mechanisms of power. So Milei is correct to say that it's coercive, but that's not just coercive. It's a intellectual corruption which conveys a very different idea of what it means to be a human being than actual justice does. Because for the socially just person, you are not simply sufficient as an individual. You are an individual cast in a social context, and that context fully shapes you, and the identity, features, and characteristics that you bear in that context say more about you than your own individuality says more about you. So it's not just about coercion, it's about a worldview. It's about the soul of humanity. It's important to recognize that. Because yes, it is good to rail against coercion. I'll be the first one to do it. I hate coercion. I think that it can only be used justly in certain circumstances. But it's not sufficient. And this is the problem that libertarians worldwide, especially in America, have really not dealt with very well. And that's why I call myself a constitutional conservative in the American context, a classical liberal elsewhere. It's because libertarians don't want to go beyond, oh, violence bad. They don't want to address the issues of the heart that must be addressed to have a free society, or really any kind of moral society at all. They simply want to stick on a level of institutions and power. They're going to have to overcome that to really unlock the potential of humanity. I think Milei has overcome that through his policies. He's addressing the issues of social justice and wokeness and why they're bad. But we have to address them on a level that's higher than just violence bad, coercion bad. All right, last point. He mentions socialism at the very end of his speech. And he says that we have to see socialism just beyond the distribution of the means of production go.
To many, it may sound ridiculous to suggest that the West has embraced socialism, but this view is only ridiculous if one limits themselves to the traditional economic definition of socialism, which states that it is an economic system where the state owns the means of production. In my opinion, this definition needs to be updated to reflect the current circumstances from my perspective. Today, states don't need to control means of production to control every aspect of individuals' lives. With tools such as monetary issuance, debt, subsidies, interest rate control, price controls, and regulations to correct alleged market failures, they can control the destinies of millions of human beings.
Now, this is a very good point. A point that, in my opinion, I don't have much really to add except to say that when we understand the roots of socialism, the roots of Marxism, the roots of all of its cousins, and we understand that they are not simply economic ideologies, these are narratives of the human story that are fundamentally enough divorced from human control. The entire idea, going all the way back to Hegel, who was allegedly the intellectual grandfather of what became Marxism, and of course the stages of Marxism being socialism and communism, is that there is this abstract moving force in history that is determinative and will take us to a certain place, regardless of what we do. Marxism is largely descriptive rather than prescriptive, which is quite interesting, because a lot of folks will say that Marxism today is prescriptive. Well, perhaps some of the more neo-Marxist variants are, but Marxism generally, as it's originally founded, is descriptive. It describes what they believe will happen in this inevitable long march through history, and the very end of the dialectical materialist process is going to be the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. But within that, there's a lot of different factors, a lot of different domains that are tapped into, that are not just the economic. It's not just the economic, not just the material, but it's something deeper as well. Again, it's not about violence or coercion or materialism. It's about a conception of humanity, that man is fundamentally structured by institutions, that his nature is malleable by society, and that his perception and his views can be whittled down to crude class-like distinctions that ignore the complexity of his humanity. That's what it's about. Socialism is not just, as Milei said, an economic system. I would say it's also a social system, which may seem obvious, but it's also a moral system, which may seem odd. It's also a philosophical system, which may seem more relevant. How is it a moral system? Because socialism casts the proper behaviors of political order, of government, through the lens of a certain narrative that tends to pit the least advantaged over the disadvantaged for no other reason and for no other purpose other than their position on the social strata. That is a kind of moral system. It's why you often see socialist and socialist adjacent people, like, for example, the United Nations, which has the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, advocate for a right to medicine, a right to be free from sickness, a right to health care, a right to be free from poverty. These are not rights as conceptualized properly during the Enlightenment. These are not rights as observed by man's power to reason. These are not rights as conceptualized by any just political order. These are rather privileges that are extended to the individual under the auspices of them being rights, because as we understand, socialists corrupt language, so the language has been corrupted and co-opted to push a political agenda, and at the detriment of that has created a new kind of moral thinking that is fundamentally flawed. So Milei is correct to recognize the complexity of socialism in our modern era, but it didn't just become like this. That phenomenon has always been sitting under the hood of the car, percolating and bubbling up, and now I think that a lot of people do see that there is more faces to the beast that the West faces than just economic materialism. So, my friends, all in all, this is a very powerful speech. In a geopolitical order ran by socialistic concepts, by collectivism, by the idea of positive rights, by moral and intellectual perversions of thought, to have someone go into the center of that level, of that stratosphere, and say this is incorrect, this is wrong, and here is why, and articulate arguments that are quite powerful, that are sound, that are based in reason and fact and sound philosophy, is to have a disruptor. And when you have a disruptor, the most important thing is not that he disrupts the institutions at that level. The most important thing is that his disruption plants a seed within the minds of those who listen to him, so that they too may become disruptors in their own right, so that the system from the bottom to the top is overturned, and there is now a correct basis, a sound blueprint for a better system that does hit at the core of what it means to be a human and what it means to have a socially prosperous and a materially prosperous society. That's the significance of this speech. Not that he went to the WEF and told them off, but that he went to the WEF on a global stage in the midst of institutions dominated by neoconservatism, dominated by socialism, dominated by positive rights, dominated by perverse financial interests, dominated by this tendency to centralize, dominated by these abstract views of man. And he then, on that level, attacked that. And then thereby doing that, gave others the motivation to do the same. The significance of being on the global stage, denouncing ideas that have shaped our geopolitical world for the past 50, 60 years, cannot be overstated. My friends in America, we should know this. Our country was founded on an intellectual tradition, divorced from familial lineage, divorced from all these crude ideas, divorced from class status and feudal status. It was the old world that America rejected, where feudal status and class status and vague notions about divinity of rulers is what conferred legitimacy. But in the new world, there was a completely different standard. And that standard spoke to truths that go beyond the king, go beyond his courts, go beyond nobility, go beyond status, and go to something about what it means to be a human being. And due to that, there was not only prosperity, there was innovation, there's a bunch of things. We have to channel that new world spirit, because right now our society has been overrun by old world phenomena. And I believe that through thinking, through a revolution of the mind, through dedication to certain ideas, we as Americans will join our Argentinian brothers and sisters in effectively breaking the yoke of old world thinking, of status-bound mentalities, off of our people forever and ever. My friends, if you want to support my message, be sure to donate to me, like this video, comment on this video, subscribe to my channel if you are new here, please. If you're interested in mostly American-based politics and commentary with a philosophical angle to it, please subscribe to me. I'd love to have you here. We're going to have a revolution of the mind, my friends. I'm so excited. I love you guys so much, and please, stay pensive. Bye, guys.